Aaron, thank you very much for joining the show. Let me start by asking, how would you sum up the risks and the opportunities presented by the fall of the Al-Assad government?
I think there's a lot of potential trajectories that could go. We could also see different events occurring more in the western part of the country than, say, in the eastern part of the country. For now, at least in the east, we've seen that there's more fighting between the Syrian National Army backed by Turkey against the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, and that could lead to potential destabilization. Important to remember that the Islamic State remains an insurgency in the east, as well as all the prisoners there. But in the western part of the country, in Damascus, we're seeing that HTS is already beginning to start its transitionary period in relation to meeting with former regime officials, handing it over to HTS's civilian government, the Salvation Government, and them announcing today that there will be a transition period now up until March 1st.
And Aaron, it seems that HTS is looking to be a little more governmental in its nature. What should we know about that opposition group, HTS, and its leader, Ahmed al-Shara, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, in the potential new administration roles?
Yeah, so we have like a 7-year plus track record of now HTS governing through its civilian technocratic apparatus called the Syrian Salvation Government. Jawlani himself has had no official role within this government. So he's essentially like an unelected official that still makes the final decisions on many things. That being said, the Salvation Government has a series of ministries like any other government. It has the Majlis al-Shura, this consultative council. It's essentially, selected by a coterie of elite men within the society, and then they kind of decide on who the ministers are. And they've been governing like most any other governments, obviously with the certain limitations of not being an official government, recognized, as well as the fact that 3/4 of its population has been displaced people. So the UN has had a large role in assisting in the IDP camps. But one of the things that they have been doing is building up these institutions, learning from lessons of crises such as COVID-19 or the earthquake in February 2023. And we've seen that at least during the offensive, before they took Damascus, that they were starting to implement the same governance structures in Aleppo as well. And therefore, I imagine that we'll see them trying to carbon copy this now in Damascus and elsewhere in the country.
I guess it should be noted, Aaron, that the group is considered a terrorist organization by the UN, Turkey, and many Western countries, many of whom have refugees wishing to return. Do you expect that status to change?
I think that it depends on the particular country. I don't think that there will be straight across the board same answer to it. I think that of all the countries that it might happen quickest, it might be Turkey. I think then some European countries, UK, might take some time, might want to, get something out of what's going on. But I think the United States in many ways will be the most strident, just because of their past being part of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda previously, as well as the fact that Jawlani was involved in war crimes, both in Iraq before he was, the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, the predecessor to HTS, as well as within Syria itself. So I think it'll be different for all the different countries trying to potentially engage with this new government.
Well, of course, HTS is the main name being bandied around, but which are the other groups vying for influence in the future of Syria?
So we have HTS, which took over Damascus more or less. You have the remnants of the old insurgency in the south, though it seems that they more or less will be letting HTS play the role, since even though the southern offensive was the first ones to get to Damascus, HTS is now beginning the transition. But then you have the Turkish-backed SNA, which continues to fight the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. But the thing with those two groups is that the SNA's main focus, because it is a Turkish proxy, is making sure that the Kurds are cut down to size more or less, and don't have any potential influence going forward. And then, of course, because they're a minority in the country, while the SDF has a role to play, they wouldn't be ones that would be necessarily controlling the country. The question is what kind of deal they might get with HTS and how that would be integrated into the broader country. And then there are also questions related to the remnants of the old regime and how that all factors in. Thus far, there's been a peaceful transition, one of the biggest questions is if there might be some extremist elements from the old regime and the Alawite community that decide that maybe they're not happy with any new arrangements and therefore start an insurgency of their own. But that is yet to bear out, but it's something to potentially watch for in the more medium term.
We have an interesting situation in that Turkey and the US, both of which are NATO members, support different groups in Syria. How do you expect that to be resolved by the incoming President Donald Trump?
Well, it's been an issue between the two countries going back a decade ago since the U.S. essentially backed the SDF in its fight against the Islamic State. It's important to remember that the only reason that the U.S. is backing the SDF is because of the global coalition's fight to take territory from the Islamic State and to make sure that it doesn't come back. And there have definitely been some uncomfortable conversations between Turkish and American officials going back a decade or so related to this, because it's important to remember that a core part of the SDF is the YPG, which is essentially the Syrian branch of the PKK, which is a designated terrorist group, not only by Turkey, but also by the United States. So it's a complicated problem. At the same time, I don't think anybody wants to see ethnic cleansing against the Kurds going forward. And the SDF has been controlling the prisons and IDP camps of the remnants of the Islamic State. So there are 10,000 male prisoners from the Islamic State that the SDF is holding, as well as tens of thousands of women and children related to the Islamic State still in its territory in northeast Syria. And of course, I don't think anybody wants to see that destabilized. Otherwise, you could kind of see the reemergence of the Islamic State, which of course the United States doesn't want.
Israel has been conducting airstrikes to take out the chance of weapons being used against it by extreme anti-Israeli groups. Now, what actual danger is there of that possibility?
I think in the near term, there's not a ton of danger related to it. It's more mitigating potential future risks. I think from a pragmatic level, HTS doesn't want to start a fight with Israel right now. Israel's kind of shown in the last year plus post the 10/7 attack in their response that it'd be a bit suicidal for HTS to start something right now. But I think Israel understands that given time from these past events, as well as space for HTS to potentially consolidate control, that maybe in 5 to 10 years, it could be an issue. And therefore, they're trying to get ahead of it. And because they have the freedom of movement now as a consequence of everything they've done over the last year or so, they're taking advantage of the situation to benefit their own security on the border.
Aaron, how is the balance of power, or how is the balance of power likely to change now in the region with regard to Israel and Iran?
Well, it's definitely been a big blow to Iran, not only in relation to Israel's response to the 10/7 attack and taking out a lot of Hamas's infrastructure, but also Hezbollah's infrastructure in Lebanon. And now with the falling of the Assad regime, this key cog between Tehran to Beirut has been stopped, and it will be a bit more difficult now for Iran to try and resupply and rebuild Hezbollah's capabilities in the aftermath of this alleged ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. And therefore, the two countries in the region, at least, that have benefited the most geopolitically speaking, are probably first Turkey and then second, possibly Israel.
Well, when we talk about balance of power, what about further afield, like Russia, for example?
Yeah, in terms of Russia, I think it's one of the more complicated questions. I think that they're relatively pragmatic. We've seen them obviously engage with the Taliban since the fall of Kabul 3+ years ago. And in many ways, I think they might look at HTS as a similar model, and therefore a country that, or a new government that they could potentially work with if they're being pragmatic to retain their interests. They want to, of course, keep a warm water port in the Mediterranean to help with all of their operations in Africa, as well as potentially harassing Europeans as well. And therefore, one of the interesting things we saw in the lead up to the offensive against the regime was that HTS put out a number of statements following November 27th, essentially saying that, while we don't agree with you doing all these airstrikes against us in the offensive, our fight really is against the regime, Iran and its Shia militia, and that we could potentially have fruitful relationships going forward if you essentially ditch the regime. And of course, we will safeguard your consular services in Aleppo, as well as any diplomatic facilities in Damascus, as well as any remaining Russian citizens that have been living in Syria. So there's clearly been some potential back channeling going on between Russia and HTS and what that could mean going forward. And at least thus far, Russia's been able to maintain its ability to have its different bases on the coast in Syria and see how that potentially plays out vis-a-vis the development of these relationships.
Well, certainly as far as the al-Assad regime, it seems that Russia and Iran were quite absent in recent times.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that the regime really was hollowed out by a decade ago, and the Russians and Iran saved them. And yet, at the same time, over this past decade, we haven't really seen the regime build up stronger institutions, make reforms so that it would be more robust and more flexible. And in fact, it's become weaker in some ways, especially considering the fact that the economy has been torn to shreds because of the economic crisis next door in Lebanon, where Syria is using a lot of its banks to continue to try and be connected to the international system, and thus creating way more inflation in the country. And because of that, due to them not necessarily reforming internally, even though the Russians and Iranians backed the regime, there were a lot of arguments. And by the time of this offensive, and the fact that it happened so quickly, and the fact that maybe there wasn't enough time to pull off a counteroffensive, both decided that we're just going to pull the cord on this and try and regroup.
Well, as happens in quite a lot of quite often in the region, factions are vying for power. So what are the chances of all these groups collaborating successfully to hold elections and rebuild Syria?
I mean, it's one of the biggest questions going forward. I don't know if necessarily we'll see elections in the way that one might conceive of it in the Western context. Based off of what I know, and if past is precedent, HTS will conduct sort of internal elections amongst elite males for positions within its Majlis al-Shura, the consultative council, and then from there, a prime minister will be selected, and the prime minister will essentially decide on ministers, and the Majlis al-Shura will essentially stamp the ministers. So it wouldn't necessarily be a broad process where every Syrian would have a say in these elections, but it would likely be notables and key elites within the society that would be deciding it, at least if the model in Idlib is put upon the rest of the country. The biggest question is how scalable this model is to the rest of the country, whether they'll pivot more and become a bit more open in their system than it was in Idlib, and also how they might integrate other factions into it. And I think a lot of, there's a greater chance for the potential that the SDF and HTS can cut a deal, since they aren't necessarily enemies with one another. It might be a bit more difficult with the Turkish-backed SNA, because they themselves have not been really governing directly, and also have not really been focused on building a country in the same way that both HTS and the SDF have been doing in their own spheres of influence. So that might be the toughest nut to crack related to it, especially since Turkey might want to use the SNA as a card to play for more influence in the new Syria.
Well, Aaron, as a final thought, with all these factions involved inside and outside the country, how likely is the alternative scenario of another civil war in Syria?
It's really hard to say. I can see a number of potential scenarios. It's definitely possible that we might see more continued fighting more in the northeast and eastern part of the country because of the SNA and the SDF, as well as the remnant Islamic State insurgency. But I suspect that things will be relatively stable in more of the western part of the country where HTS controls. And the biggest question is how HTS can reconcile its new polity and its building up of it with the eastern part of the country.
Aaron Zelin, thank you very much for giving us your analysis on the situation there.
Thanks for having me.